The small town of Dry Creek baked under the sun that summer, its dusty main street shimmering like a mirage. People gathered around the wooden platform outside the saloon, laughing and calling out as if it were a fair. But it wasn't a fair. It was an auction, a cruel show meant to amuse men who had too much whiskey and too little kindness. James Weller rode into town on his old brown horse, not planning to stay long. He was a quiet rancher, known for living alone on the far edge of the prairie. His land was wide and lonely, and after losing his wife 5 years ago, he had stopped speaking much to anyone. He only came to town when supplies ran low: flour, salt, nails, a few letters from the post office. But that day, something different caught his eye. On the platform stood a small Chinese girl. Her hands were tied loosely in front of her, her black hair tangled by the wind. She couldn't have been more than 20, and her dark eyes were filled with fear and confusion. The crowd shouted things she didn't understand. The auctioneer called her a debt worker from the railroad camp, pretending it was a joke. People laughed. James stopped near the hitching post and looked up, frowning. "What's going on here?" he asked a man beside him. "Oh, just a bit of fun," the man replied with a grin. "Some of the boys bought this girl off a foreman who couldn't pay his tab. Thought we'd see who wants her now. Maybe you need a helper, rancher?" James's stomach turned. It wasn't fun. It was shameful. But before he could turn his horse around, a group of loud men noticed him. One of them, Hank Dillard, a cruel ranch hand known for his drinking, called out, "Hey, Weller, you live all alone, don't you? Let's give you a wife today." The crowd laughed again. Before James could refuse, Hank tossed a silver coin toward the auctioneer and shouted, "Sold! Give her to the lonely cowboy." The auctioneer, grinning nervously, pushed the girl off the platform. She stumbled forward and nearly fell, and James instinctively caught her before she hit the ground. The crowd roared with laughter. "There you go, Weller. She's all yours," someone shouted. "Don't let her run away now." James stood still, his jaw tightening. The girl trembled in his arms, her breath shallow. He looked around at the faces, men who once called him a good neighbor. And for the first time in years, he felt real anger. He didn't say a word. He simply took off his hat, placed it gently on the girl's head, and said quietly, "You'll ride home with me." The laughter faded. The men exchanged uneasy looks. No one expected that answer. James helped the girl onto his horse and rode out of town without looking back. The road was long and silent. The girl sitting behind him didn't speak. When they reached the ranch, the sky was turning red with sunset. He helped her down and led her inside the small wooden house. It wasn't much, just a kitchen, a small room, and a fireplace that hadn't seen warmth in weeks. He lit a lamp and placed a plate of bread and stew on the table. "Eat," he said softly. The girl looked at the food, unsure. She didn't understand much English, but she recognized kindness. Slowly, she picked up the spoon. After she ate, James handed her a folded blanket. "You can sleep here," he said, pointing to the small room at the back. "No one's going to hurt you." She bowed her head slightly, trying to speak. Her voice was soft and careful. Why you help me?" James stared into the fire for a long moment before answering. Because nobody else did. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the window, listening to the wind. The house, once so quiet, now felt different. Not empty anymore, but uncertain. He didn't know what to do with her or what people would say. He only knew one thing. He couldn't return her to that crowd. In the days that followed, the girl, May Lynn, as he later learned from the paper she carried, began to move carefully around the ranch. She watched how James worked, how he treated the horses, how he fixed the fences. She copied his actions quietly. When she noticed the water bucket was empty, she carried it. When she saw tools lying in the dirt, she gathered them neatly. She didn't need to be told much. James spoke little, but sometimes, when he saw her trying hard to learn, he would smile faintly. "You're doing fine," he'd say. She'd nod shyly, not always understanding the words but recognizing the warmth in his tone. The neighbors, however, didn't stay quiet. Whenever James rode into town, whispers followed him. Some said he'd gone soft. Others said he was crazy for keeping a girl he'd been mocked with. One man even spat on the ground and said, "She ain't one of us." James didn't answer. He bought his supplies and left, his back straight, his face calm. At home, May Lynn found an old book of English letters and started tracing the words by the light of the fire. She pointed to the letters and asked, "This?" And he'd answer A. Then she'd repeat softly, A. Her voice was steady, eager to learn. Bit by bit, she began to speak simple words. Good morning. Thank you. Horse tired. One evening, as the sky turned violet, she brought James a bowl of soup she had tried to cook. It was too salty, but he ate it anyway and said it was good. She smiled for the first time since he met her. It was a small smile, uncertain but real. But not all was easy. One morning, a few rough riders from town stopped by the ranch gate. They leaned on their saddles and laughed loudly, asking James how his little bride was doing. James stood on the porch, his face unreadable. She's doing fine, he said quietly. Better than most of you. The laughter died quickly. The men turned their horses and rode off, muttering under their breath. That night, Maylin cried softly in her room. James heard her and knocked gently on the door. You all right? He asked. She didn't answer. When he opened the door, he found her sitting on the floor holding her small paper, the one with her father's name written in Chinese. I shame you, she whispered. I should go. James knelt beside her. You don't shame me, he said firmly. They do. You've done nothing wrong. She shook her head, tears shining on her cheeks. They laugh you, she said in broken words. Because me. James looked at her for a long time before speaking again. Let them laugh. I stopped caring about laughter a long time ago. He stood, took his hat from the hook and set it gently on her head again, the same way he had that first day. You're safe here. That's what matters. Days turned into weeks and something warm began to grow between them, not spoken but felt. Maylin would hum softly while working, and James found himself listening to her voice instead of the silence he had lived in for years. Sometimes when she smiled at him, he forgot the loneliness that had once filled his heart. One evening, she tried to leave. She packed a small bag and walked quietly toward the gate, thinking he was asleep. She didn't want to be a burden or a memory of a cruel joke. But before she reached the fence, James was already there waiting. Where are you going? He asked gently. She froze, holding her bag close. I go, she said. You good man. I go away. He took a slow step forward, his voice low and steady. If you walk away, you'll take my heart with you. Maylin looked up at him, her eyes wide, not sure she understood. But the tone, the softness, said everything words couldn't. She dropped the bag and tears filled her eyes again. Not from fear this time, but from something deeper, something new. James reached out and took her hand, and for the first time since that awful day in town, she felt safe, not as someone who had been given away, but as someone who had been chosen. The wind carried the scent of rain that night, and the lonely ranch finally felt alive again. Morning sunlight spread across the prairie, warming the grass and the quiet ranch. Maylin stepped outside, feeling the soft wind brush her face. It had been months since that cruel day in town, and life had slowly changed. The fear that once followed her like a shadow had started to fade. She had learned to cook bread that didn't burn, to ride the calm old horse named Dusty, and to say small sentences in English that made James smile. James had changed, too. The man who once lived in silence now spoke softly over breakfast, telling her about the weather or the cattle. He taught her how to plant seeds in the small garden near the porch, showing her how deep to press the soil. Sometimes when he returned from the fields, he would find the house clean, the lamp trimmed and tea waiting on the table. He never said much, but his quiet thank you meant more than long speeches ever could. But outside the ranch, the world hadn't changed. People still whispered. When James came to town for supplies, he felt the stares. There goes the man who married a foreign girl, some said. Bought himself a wife, didn't he? Others joked behind his back. He never answered. He simply paid for his goods and walked away. One afternoon, as he loaded sacks of feed onto his wagon, the local preacher, Reverend Cole, approached him carefully. James, he said, folks have been talking. They say you live with that girl, but are you married to her? James looked up slowly. No, he said. Not yet. The preacher hesitated, choosing his words. You're a good man, James. You've done more kindness than most would. But for her sake, maybe you should make it right in the eyes of the town and the Lord. James nodded, thoughtful. He wasn't a man who cared much for gossip, but the preacher's words stayed in his mind all the way home. That night, he sat by the fire while Maylin mended one of his shirts. She hummed softly, her small hands moving carefully with the needle. Maylin, he said at last, She looked up, curious. You happy here? She nodded with a gentle smile. Yes, happy. Then after a pause she asked, You not happy? He smiled faintly. I am. More than I've been in a long time. He hesitated, then said, Would you want my name? Not because of what happened before, but because you deserve a name that can't be taken from you. She didn't understand right away. Your name? She asked softly. He reached for a folded paper on the table, a marriage license he'd brought back from town. Yes, he said. My name, Weller. Maylin stared at the paper. Her eyes widened slightly and her hands trembled. Me, wife? If you'll have me, James said gently. No one will ever call you a joke again. For a long moment she didn't move. Then tears filled her eyes and she nodded, whispering, Yes. The next Sunday, the small church on the hill stood quiet in the early morning light. Reverend Cole waited at the door, surprised to see James walking up the path with Maylin by his side. She wore a simple white dress made from old fabric she had sewn herself. Her hair was tied back neatly and she held a single wildflower she had picked near the creek. Inside the church, only a few people sat in the pews. Most came out of curiosity, whispering among themselves. But when the ceremony began, the whispers stopped. James stood tall, his rough hand steady as he took hers. When the preacher asked if he would love and protect her, he said, I already have. When it was Maylin's turn, her English faltered, but her meaning was clear. I promise, she said softly. I keep heart with you always. The preacher smiled, his voice gentle. Then I now declare you husband and wife. As James slipped a small silver ring onto her finger, a tear rolled down her cheek. It wasn't sadness, it was peace. For the first time since she arrived in this strange land, she felt like she belonged. When they stepped outside, the wind lifted her veil lightly, and James helped her down the church steps. The crowd watched silently. A few nodded with quiet respect. The cruel laughter that had once followed them was gone. Back at the ranch, the day passed in a warm blur. James built a small fence around the garden she loved. Maylin hung white curtains in the window. She wrote her new name carefully on the back of an old letter, Maylin Weller. She stared at it for a long time, tracing the letters with her finger, smiling through tears. Years went by. The ranch grew stronger, and so did they. The land was kind to them, rewarding their hard work. When their first child was born, a small boy with his mother's eyes and his father's calm smile, the old loneliness in James's heart disappeared completely. The same men who once laughed at him now tipped their hats when they passed his land. The ranch was no longer silent. It echoed with children's laughter and the soft music of Maylin singing lullabies in her gentle voice. One spring afternoon, as James fixed a fence post, he saw riders approaching, the same group of men from years before. They slowed near the gate, their faces older, their eyes unsure. Maylin stood on the porch with their 2 children, holding the baby in her arms. She smiled politely, her calm presence silencing whatever jokes they had planned. Hank Dillard, once the loudest of the group, took off his hat awkwardly. Ranch looks good, Weller, he muttered. James only nodded. It's home. They rode away quietly after that. The story of that cruel joke faded from memory, replaced by the quiet truth that kindness had built something lasting. Every evening, when the sun dipped low behind the hills, Maylin made tea and waited by the porch. James would come in from the fields, tired but content, and sit beside her. The two would watch the golden sky turn to violet. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't need to. James, she said once, resting her head on his shoulder, you give me name, I give you heart. He smiled and squeezed her hand. You gave me more than that, Maylin. You gave me life again. As the years passed, their children grew. The ranch flourished, and the story of how they met became something told only in whispers of wonder. People no longer spoke of an auction or a joke. They spoke of a man who had chosen kindness when others chose cruelty, and of a woman who turned that kindness into love. On the 20th anniversary of their marriage, James carved 2 words into the wooden porch rail where they often sat together. It read simply, Maylin's home. That night, as the stars shone above the wide plains, Maylin brought him tea as always. She smiled and said in her soft accent, Your name, my honor. James looked at her, the same warmth in his eyes as the day he first placed his hat on her head. "And your heart," he said quietly. "My forever." The wind carried the scent of blooming flowers across the land that had once been lonely. The man who was once the subject of laughter, and the girl who was once treated as nothing, had built something stronger than pride, a family, a legacy and a love story born not from power or chance, but from simple human decency. And in the years to come, when travelers passed the Weller Ranch, they often heard laughter from the porch, saw children playing in the tall grass, and smelled the sweet aroma of tea drifting in the wind. Few remembered the cruel day that started it all, but everyone knew the truth of what kindness could do. Because one man refused to laugh with the crowd, and one frightened girl found a home where she could finally smile, and together, they wrote a story that time could never erase.